Hello everyone, Adil here, and best of luck to both teams.
Hi everyone, my name is Joy and I'm going to be the other panelist pronounced she, her. Good luck to everyone.
Could we have the teams on government introduce themselves?
Hi, I'm Manuela. I'll be first speaker. My pronouns are she, her.
Hello, I'm Diego. I'm gonna be the second speaker, he, him pronouns.
Hi, I'm Javiera. I will be third speaker. Also, Manuela, please enter your phone.
Cool. Opposition?
Hi, I'm Callum, speaking first. He, they, please.
Hello, I'm Sophie. My pronouns are she, they, please. I'm speaking second in reply.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'll be speaking third, and my pronouns are she, her, please.
Cool. Without further ado, let's get started. I call upon the PM to give a speech in 8 minutes. You're here.
Great. Just to confirm if I'm audible and visible to you guys.
Yep.
Awesome. I'll start on my first word. Hate speech is a growing threat in modern society. It hinders political discourse, threatens the most vulnerable groups in society, and creates a never-seen-before level of polarization. Substack should comply with this social responsibility and limit hate speech. For setup, 3 points. Firstly, Substack is a platform that offers a unique space for people to share their thoughts and ideas with their subscribers via email newsletters. It has become extremely violent for citizen journalists, creative writers, and people sharing general reflections on life, society, and politics. Secondly, hate speech is abusive or threatening writing that expresses prejudice because of their identity, and this includes things such as ethnicity, religion, and sexual orientation. Note how these are insults that do not relate to a person's ideas, but aspects about their identity that are intrinsic to them. Thirdly, Substack is likely to regulate hate speech using AI to flag any content that directly attacks a person's identity, and then having it reviewed by a committee that regulates speech within the company. This has been implemented by other social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Threads, TikTok, among other things. It is important to highlight that these platforms have clear guidelines that clearly establish the limits between what constitutes hate speech or not. This is easily recognizable since it has to be a direct attack on a person's identity. No, thank you. Moving on to our first speech, which is Substack has accepted a social responsibility. For context, Substack has already accepted that they have a social responsibility to control the content of their platform, like Facebook for hate speech that have been filed and won using the same reasoning. Substack should regulate hate speech because it is equally harmful to society as other things that it is already regulating. And thirdly, Substack already has a social responsibility where they have pleaded to protect people applying harmful and inappropriate practices in real life. Because they have already put this burden in their shoulders, this grants them a status as editors of content because it means they are directly overlooking and analyzing the content of their platform, but actively deciding not to do anything about hate speech. Just like there are algorithms that exist to prevent the inciting of violence, there are algorithms that exist to prevent hate speech as they are both done using language. Firstly, they have to protect their own users from harmful and inappropriate material. Secondly, they are subject to protecting any type of violence or inappropriate behavior that is subject to harm any other group or people or community. Thirdly, this means that if the policies of Substack already uses to regulate potential inappropriate behavior and already has a goal, then they already have the goal to protect people from harmful online harm and violence. And fourthly, they would also be protecting the larger community from the polarization that hate speech causes. And it can cause divisions between groups because it incites hate speech between them, and hate that can turn into death. No, thank you, as we have seen in the world recently. Fourthly, if Substack already wants to implement this throughout their platform with the goal of preventing harm, they should ban hate speech as well, because it has the same violent effects as pornography and as inciting violence. What the problem is, firstly, let's clarify that the hate speech is carried out in a low moderated platform such as Substack. It is not like hate speech in real life, because it isn't as moderate as in real life, meaning that when people say hate speech in public, they will say it in a less harmful and violent way, since they can get in trouble. However, because Substack is famous for its low moderation system, they are more incentivized to say their hate speech in a more explicit and harmful way, because one, it is affected by the community and peers around them, and are therefore encouraged to put it into practice too. And secondly, they are exemplified by their authors that they're subscribed to, because authors are people that they are influenced by and they choose to subscribe to them. So when these authors are publishing it, that means that they're influenced as well. But thirdly, therefore, this means that communities that are largely affected by them will be 10 times more harmed and marginalized because of how explicit people can be in social media, especially with the platform known for its low moderation. But why is this so detrimental? Two things here. Firstly, normalizing the practice of people criticizing and making slurs against vulnerable individuals' identities, constantly saying the N-word, racial slurs, and making fun of the cultures of vulnerable communities found in Substack is extremely harmful to their identity and well-being. But secondly, it influences the minds of people that use Substack so much to the great extent that is harming communities. And because this is already creating more harm to communities, that violence and porn, Substack already has the responsibility to ban it as well as the quick spread of it. But what do we change on our side? Firstly, we prevent the negative spread of hate speech. We see this especially with people being heavily influenced by hate speech and implementing them into our daily lives. But because it is being moderated under our side, we not only prevent the practice of hate speech on the platform, but also in our daily lives. Preventing polarization of communities that are being already marginalized within opposition side of the therefore, people don't have to be afraid when logging into Substack with the fear of being almost immediately criticized by society. Thirdly, we are preventing hate speech from influencing people to practice it in their daily lives, because it is something that is no longer normalized, and therefore people are more alert to the consequences of hate speech as in real life, because it is now no longer a hate space, safe space to explicitly and violently say them. And B, Substack is already preventing such an incredibly large group of people from using hate speech because of the message that Substack promotes. Moving on to our second argument about people not having a right to spread hate speech. For context, in a vast majority of cases, hate speech necessarily breaches the individual rights of another person, generally who belongs to a minority group. This looks like the use of slurs to refer to groups as hate speech spreads harmful prejudices surrounding their identity, like sexuality, religion, and race. Judges, even if opposition tries to undermine the impact of the hate speech by saying that its effect is marginal, it is key to understand that hate speech inherently breaches the rights of people to integrity, dignity, and peaceful coexistence on 2 points. Firstly, people simply can't skip this stop. Even if those harmed aren't listening, by spreading hate speech, the people inherently are inherently breaching rights, and this is unforgivable. It's crucial to understand that even in Op's best case, we're sure the hate speech doesn't reach like a victim, it still and principally harms the rhetoric, and it could have harmed someone. Note, hate speech is easily normalized, which leads to individuals internalizing the prejudices. Secondly, when hate speech is normalized, it means that users view it as less harmful, meaning they start using it themselves. Even if unconsciously, this is bad because one, it leads to the normalization of breaching others' rights, which is unacceptable principally. Secondly, tangibly, it leads to the internalization of harmful prejudices. These people are less accepting. And this results in these people being less sympathetic with these vulnerable groups, which are in the long run can lead to radicalization and violence. But even without it, principally, no one should be able to violate someone else's rights. Highly proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank that speaker for the remarks. Call upon the leader of opposition to give a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Here.
Can everyone hear and see me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Oh, just getting a timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What Proposition want to do is they want to push this potential hate speech off of platforms such as Substack and into platforms that are more publicly viewed, into platforms that victimize these people, into platforms that ultimately increase polarization and increase hate speech. Under their side, they do not actually help those that they set out to in their first. A couple of things in today's speech. First of all, setup, then refutation, then 2 arguments. 3 arguments. One, on how Substack is very poor at regulating. Second of all, on how people are pushed to other platforms. And third of all, how there is a victimized narrative for these people that are spreading so-called hate speech. First of all, on setup, 2 bits of setup. 1, what does this hate speech actually look like? I want to note 3 things. A, it is simply not incitement to violence, as in info slide, which means that all the harms Proposition talk about are very marginal at the point at which you're not encouraging someone to actively go out and hurt someone else. B, it is likely these people on these platforms are only on the borders of acceptability, i.e. they might just be using out-of-date language or discussing a certain political issue and political stance. They're not necessarily calling people slurs or saying certain things about certain groups that is incredibly derogatory. And that's because that sort of behavior exists more on social media. No, thank you. That is where the sort of polarization actually occurs that you're talking about. These sort of platforms, such as Substack, are more academic. They are long-form journals where you express your views, you discuss them in a nuanced way. It is not simply calling people slurs. What that means is it's not as harmful as they tell you. Second of all, what are our paths to victory? 2-fold. A, we prove to you there's an infringement of discourse. This means advancements in society are slowed down. People, the marginalized groups are not informed that other people care about them because you ultimately restrict discourse. B, you increase the danger authors pose, which means, i.e. hate speech is actually worse under Proposition. And C, they do not actually regulate anything and there's no change under their side of the house. Let's move on to refutation, and I want to respond to a couple of things. First of all, I want to respond to this idea that Substack has a social responsibility and is ultimately fulfilling this by under their side of the motion and protecting the users. 3 responses to this. First of all, Substack are the platform, not the creators. What that means is Substack are simply like the platform exists for people to share their ideas. They are not the ones inciting this hate. They are not the ones condoning this hate. They are simply letting people talk. If you're in a room with others and other people are talking, well, thank you, other people are talking about hate speech, you're not in the moral wrong at the point at which you don't talk up. You're simply a bystander in that case. Second of all, the people that are actually consuming these articles and these newsletters on Substack opt into this. That is to say that you're only going to follow someone and subscribe to someone that you like their views of and that you agree with. What that means is the people they're talking to you that are apparently harmed by hate speech do not subscribe to the right-wing extremists. They simply subscribe to left-wing people that are more within their ideology. Therefore, the people they think are harmed do not actually consume this media in the first place. But thirdly, let's look at the scale of harm, because we already established in characterization, this is very marginal in terms of it's not violence. It is likely only minimal hate speech at best. Second thing I want to respond to this idea is this idea, even if people do not consume this, it is still inherently negative because it is crucial to your identity. I want to compare this to the principle of freedom of speech, because being able to express your ideas in a free way is also crucial to your identity. The point at which we are humans and are capable of rational thoughts and able to express our feelings, that is something that we should be able to in a society and should not be restricted, given it is key to our dignity. Note, we are not talking about people necessarily spreading hate speech, as we'll talk about later. There's also many people that are caught in the crossfire of that, and no thank you, and their newsletters are simply taken down as well, meaning they're infringing hate speech of people they do not actually help. Finally, on normalization, 2 responses. One refers back to the response in terms of how the groups viewing this are likely already normalized to these ideas. And second of all, they continually tell you do not share these things in public under either side of the house. Therefore, I don't see how normalization has any impact. On to the first argument then, on how Substack are incredibly poor at regulating. The thesis of this argument is that large companies simply do not get it right already. I don't see why a smaller company such as Substack with less expertise is going to achieve what they did not. 2 strands to this as to why they are poor at regulating. First of all, it's incredibly difficult. There are 2 reasons for this. A, algorithms are simply inefficient. They tell you it's going to be used by AI. AI is incredibly binary, but speech is incredibly layered. That is to say, there's things such as irony and sarcasm the AI does not understand because there's things that are key to the human experience. Therefore, difficult, no thank you, difficult to pick up from. But additionally, these sort of phrases are constantly changing. You're constantly using different euphemisms or different words to describe different things. It's incredibly hard to keep up on. Therefore, under their side of the house, you default to simply banning a lot of content when something is flagged as potentially harmful because you do not know what the difference is in terms of these algorithms. Secondly, the people that are coding these things are not experts in sociological issues. That is to say, coders and computer scientists are not sociologists. Therefore, they do not understand something as acceptable and therefore simply again resort to default, simply overburdening and overbanning. Second strand of this is they have incentives to go overboard in the first place. Even if they have the ability to simply do this right, they want to go overboard for two reasons. One, they fear repercussion at the point at which they don't want to face legal challenges or people moving away from their platforms. Therefore, they are more cautious and ensure there's no slipping through the gap. And secondly, they want to push evidence that their planning is working, and therefore they're wanting to increase the rates of articles and newsletters that are banned, and therefore simply go overboard. What are the impacts of this? Twofold. A, you simply get an infringement of speech without any moral harm to justify that. That is to say, we're not talking about hate speech in proposition best case scenario. We're talking about people that are caught in the crossfire. People that are simply publishing things in newsletters that may actually be condoning hate speech and talking about why it's bad. They are caught in the crossfires. They are taken down. That's simply an infringement of the free speech without any justification. But B, you reduce political advancement. You're not going to get any people changing minds. You're not going to inform voters. You're going to ultimately damage democracy to the point at which you cannot have discourse because you're removing anything remotely political because you're going overboard. Note, Substack is incredibly nuanced and it's not like social media. A, there's a flow of argument versus on social media, it's simply a sentence. Therefore, it's incredibly difficult to compare. They cannot compare this debate to social media. And B, social media is not discourse. It is simply saying slurs. Substack is not that. Substack is far more nuanced. On to the second argument then, on how they are pushed to other platforms. First of all, these people already exist on the fringes of these platforms, are already likely to move off it because A, like newsletters are not common, you're likely to be very passionate about your subject, and B, you consume other media that causes similar views about how the establishment is simply against you. Therefore, you believe the establishment is against you, and you're more likely to tip in favor of going to other platforms under side proposition. The reason you tip to these other platforms is you still want to share your views and still want to share what you want to say, but Substack are preventing you from doing so. Therefore, you find alternative means. But B, you're more likely to speak out more loudly because you feel like you're being pushed. The delta is very crucial. These other platforms are A, in the public sphere. This is where the harms of hate speech come from. B, are less regulated because things such as Twitter are incredibly difficult to restrict incitement to violence. And C, are simply more angry because they feel like they are being exploited and they're being pushed out. What this means is you hurt the groups that you actually want to protect. You're creating more polarization under their side of the house. On to the final argument then on the victimized nature. This is very simple. As we've already explained, these people feel like they are being pushed off these platforms. They feel like their freedom is being infringed. What this means is there's more sympathy towards them at the point at which moderates think their rights are being restricted. But B, there's more anger towards them and then more anger towards the establishment and people on the left because they believe they're restricting the right to discourse. And C, there's simply more of a platform for these views because there's anger and that sympathy. What this means is you A, further entrench these views, B, convince moderates under their side of the house that hate speech is not necessarily negative, and C, you shift the conversation away from what really matters, shifts away from the vulnerable people that are being hurt towards caring about these people who are pursuing hate speech. For all those reasons, because we help the vulnerable groups the most, so proud to oppose.
Paying that speaker for their remarks, call upon the proposition second to give a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Here. Is prop second there?
Yes, sorry, I'm setting up. Give me 1 second.
No worries.
Okay. At the top of my speech, I want to address the opposition's main claim that people are going to leave from Substack into other platforms that are going to be have more viewership. I think this is untrue for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because Substack has unique benefits. I know that opposition one already recognized that this is mainly academic text. For instance, if you want to move this content to Twitter, you're not able to do this simply because on Twitter you cannot share that content that is that long. Manuela told you since first that oftentimes Substack is used by academics, creative writing, or journalists themselves who want to publish longer text of writing and do not have access to this bigger platform. So we believe that this unique benefits that Substack has means that you are not unlikely to move to other platforms because other platforms don't have the ability for you to publish that. That is why Substack has a competitive advantage, and that is why a lot of people are choosing it in the first place. But secondly, I think the reason why a lot of people are not going to move to Substack is simply because of the fact that we think that since they know that it has a commitment towards like not monitoring oftenly, that probably means that they know that they have an incentive of actually regulating these things in a way that is proper and does not limit political discourse. But I will continue expanding on this in my speech. So this just goes to show that on this side of the house, it's very unlikely that people are going to move to a different platform, and that is why this is not a harm in and of itself. Opposition necessarily has to prove why this Substack does not have a responsibility to do this, but secondly, they have to prove why exercising that responsibility creates a greater harm, and they fail to do so at the moment. So let's move on into our first clash. And here, let's answer the question, does Substack actually have a social responsibility to regulate hate speech? So the main claim to prove that Substack has a responsibility to regulate hate speech is as follows. It has already assumed a responsibility as an editor of content, since it already regulates incitements of violence, pornography, and other things. I know this is what the info slide tells us. So this is what oftentimes has been argued in courts of law because of the fact that in the moment in which you are already being the editor of content and you're monitoring that thing, you're making an active decision not to regulate that hate speech. So any harm that's caused by that hate speech, you have some responsibility to it because you decided not to prevent it. So in that moment, in the same way as a teacher, for instance, is held responsible in a court of law for not reporting bullying and harassment that it's end up affecting a children's life and children's well-being. Simply because the teacher is a witness of that violence, they have to report it, even though they might not be enabled it, but the fact that they're not doing anything it just goes to show that those are the ones being held responsible. So what are the harms of hate speech? Because opposition one tries to minimize them, but the truth is that they're harsh and they're extreme, and opposition one needs to engage with this. Because the truth is that before, the law would only consider attacks to our physical persona. But now that psychologists and doctors have long acknowledged the importance of our mental well-being for human life, we actually understand that hate speech is extremely harmful for individuals because it oftentimes affects your perception of your own identity, the perception of who you are, and it pushes teenagers or many other individuals to feel bad about themselves. And in many other instances, it leads to more extreme situations such as committing suicide or simply not feeling okay with expressing your own identity because of the fact that you're constantly seeing this hate speech on this platform. And note that it's not about you deciding not simply to unsubscribe, because then you are restricting yourself from other benefits that you might get from this author or from Substack. So that probably means that others do not have a right to actually spread that hate speech, because otherwise you'll be putting those individuals in an even more vulnerable position because opposition is forcing them to either unsubscribe, which means that probably means that they're restricting themselves from a lot of the benefits that they get in Substack. And we believe that since these are the most vulnerable stakeholders in this case, because these are groups who are constantly discriminated against, we have a social responsibility to protect them in the first place, and opposition needs to engage with that. But I think the second harm is on political discourse. And I think opposition misses completely our analysis on this point, because it's not that this is not about it's more on the fact that you are actually attacking somebody else's identity. In the moment in which you start attacking somebody else's identity, you immediately harm political discourse, because now it doesn't longer become about debating about ideas, but it becomes about me attacking your identity and so on and forth. So it no longer is about debating whether policy is good or bad, but it's simply about who is proposing it. And based on that, an individual cannot change that. So it's unfair and unlikely that this will actually have any productive capacity. So, and opposition's response to all of our claims, simply claiming that exercising this responsibility is going to create a lot of harm to political discourse. But I think there's 4 reasons why this is not true. Firstly, hate speech tends to be explicit, and that is why it's extremely harmful, i.e., it includes the F word to call on gay people, it includes the N word to call on Black people. These are very clear attacks, and their identifications not ambiguous at all. So opposition cannot squirrel the motion, tell that on our side, we're simply going to limit other types of speech as well. Secondly, hate speech is the opposite of political discourse. Most debaters speak at tremendous speed, and we're still able to identify whether I'm engaging with your ideas or your identity. Political discourse requires people to debate ideas, not identities. Thirdly, guidelines are public, so in the terms and service conditions. So that means that a lot of individuals are actively putting on their input in order for them to improving those guidelines that actually regulate what's hate speech or not. So that we believe that there's mechanisms for people to improve them. But fourthly, since there has been a growing movement against platforms that regulate hate speech, these platforms have started to implement certain policies to reassure consumers that they're not silencing their free speech. For example, establishing committees to create these guidelines that include people across the political spectrum. And that opposition's one response is basically that oftentimes this evolves, and that is why it's hard to follow, because it uses euphemisms or things like that. But I think in order for it to be considered hate speech, and in order for it to be considered harmful, a large amount of people need to recognize that word as bad and attack on an identity. And that is when the committee and these platforms are also able to recognize that word as harmful. Secondly, they tell us that AI is binary and it's unlikely to identify this. Note that we already told you in our mechanism that this is also going to be viewed by a human being. But most importantly, I think AI is not binary at all. For instance, ChatGPT is able to generate a lot of things. The reason why is this debate winning is because it proves that the responsibility, Substack does have a responsibility to implement this action, and exercising that responsibility does not create a harm in society. Before we want to make second class,
do you really think minorities would be subscribed to a right-wing journalist that spreads hate speech in the first place?
Right-wing journalists oftentimes have great political ideas, great economical ideas. They will preventing themselves from actively accessing that information. Oftentimes, minorities do vote Republican simply because they agree on other political issues. So I do think they do. So now let's move into our second class very briefly. So the people actually have a right to spread hate speech. I think the reason why I'm spending so little on this flashpoint is because opposition one did not engage with our second argument at all. Because the truth is that always our rights have limits on other people. Our rights are limited in the moment in which we start infringing somebody else's, and in the moment in which we people do not have a right to spread hate speech, especially because these are not ideas as opposition one likes to claim. As I already told you previously in my speech, this is literally an attack on somebody else's identity. Probably you can continue to express your political ideas without saying the F word or without saying the N word. Those deals are still possible to do. You don't have to commit an attack on somebody else in order for you to get your ideas across. So that just goes to show that we're not limiting political discourse on our side of the house. And actually, if you're hurting somebody else, your right ends up there. And therefore, if we do a weighing of rights, we understand that the rights of these minorities and these vulnerable individuals should be prioritized, because we have a responsibility as a society to prioritize those most vulnerable individuals. So if we're talking about a right-wing journalist, we will probably prioritize the most vulnerable in this case. And for that reasons, this is a very clear ballot for team proposition. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their speech. Call upon the second opposition speaker to give a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. You're here.
Can everyone see and hear me okay? Excellent,
Yep.
thank you very much. POIs, as you wish, you can pop them in chat or you can unmute, up to you. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it would take more than 10 times the length of this debate. In fact, it would take infinite time for us to explain to you all of the types of hate speech which could be on these platforms. Now, that's particularly true when, unlike Twitter, this isn't limited characters. This isn't people shouting slurs into the abyss. It's complex political discussion. There is simply no way beyond the literal slurs that they exemplify to you that they can truly understand what hate speech is. No way any algorithm can truly understand that. Notice that all their principles, all their impacts rely on them accurately being able to prevent hate speech from happening. And because they don't accurately prove why that's able to happen, then they're losing this round. Okay, a couple of things to engage with. Firstly, I'm going to look at the capacity of these platforms to regulate them in the first place. Then I'm going to look at the likely reactions of these authors. Then I'm going to look at the implications of hate speech, dealing with some of their extra analysis on things like role of the platform on the way. Okay, firstly then, let's talk about what we think is likely. Callum does for you a huge amount of analysis as to why these are likely to be very, very bad at understanding what hate speech is, why it's binary and speech is much more layered, why what is normalized changes all the time and you are unable to keep pace with those. They tell you, but you know, AI is becoming really, really good now. It is able to like generate things. But the truth is all of these algorithms are just incredibly poor at understanding human emotion in the nuanced way that it is expressed, because they fundamentally have to recognize things like words. That means recognizing words and not being able to understand the context around them, right? I think all of Callum's analysis still stands here as he talks to you why human emotion is much more nuanced in those cases. What this means is this still applies, but I'm going to be very, very charitable here, because what they tell you is a human body will review it. One, notice how this is incredibly unrealistic, because your capacity to review all content on a platform is impossible. But two, what I think is more likely is even in the most charitable cases is a huge amount of material getting suspended in the meantime that is being reviewed by these boards. What this means is, given the sheer amount that these boards are having to go through, I think this looks like posts being retroactively removed. I think this looks like posts just not being able to be posted for, I don't know, many months, perhaps a year at a time, because it's going to take these boards so long to be able to review them. I think a reliance on algorithms is likely, and those algorithms are poor, but if not, they're suspended. That still means that they're going to have the infringement on free speech that we talk about. Crucially, though, what a key part of Callum's analysis here is just the capacity to understand what hate speech is really, really difficult. There is a reason why countries around the world all have different hate speech laws and different platforms all have hate speech laws. This is because it is actually incredibly difficult to define what you believe hate speech to be, because the political meta of that country might be entirely different. I.e., if the laws are different and they don't protect like certain groups, then hate speech is entirely different. Because if you don't enshrine trans rights in your laws, of course saying that a trans woman isn't a woman no longer constitutes hate speech in that country. What this means is on international platforms, it is pretty much impossible to enforce a universal description of hate speech. Let's weigh this then. What we explained to you is that, one, they guarantee to let some hate speech fall through the cracks because they're bad at identifying it. If bigots are like really, really dedicated, they can probably get around these algorithms quite successfully. Two, we've proven to you that free speech is likely to encroach greatly. We think the likely response to this is that they crack down to a much, much greater extent, and this means they're removing a huge amount of hate speech. Okay, let's weigh this then. Why do we think that the infringement on this likelihood of free speech is worse than the nebulous harms of hate speech? This is because fundamentally, as we described to you, these are incredibly nebulous and hard to quantify. Given we already legislate against the worst things like incitement to violence, these laws are much, much more clear because it's things like we should go and commit violence, which is much easier to identify. We already legislate against that. The delta here is just really minimal and unclear. We talk about why these people are unlikely to be engaging. The people who would be most harmed by hate speech are unlikely to be engaging in the first place. What we can tell you is that when the point of a platform is for you to express your free speech and that is being infringed upon, it limits your capacity to express an identity, the views that comprise your own identity, the views that comprise your understanding of the political sphere, right? And this just means that free speech is being infringed upon to a much greater extent than they can actually convince you there is a large harm of the hate speech that happens. Let's move on then, right? Let's start talking a little bit about Substack. A couple of some of the things they tell you about Substack. They tell you this principal argument that they've accepted a social responsibility to protect people. I'm going to respond to this in two ways. Firstly, look at why they don't have responsibility. Second, on like why this is distinct from incitement to violence. One, they just don't have this duty of care. I want you to consider the analogous things panel, right? As an owner of a building, I do not have a responsibility to like guarantee that someone doesn't say hate speech within my building because it is a forum. If someone posted like stuck something up in a public space, that is comparative in the sense that it is a public forum on which someone is posting, and the regulations that they have do not fall in place. Because the truth is, government is the only actor which has a duty of care in this round. If panel, you really, really believe that hate speech should be regulated against, then you should believe that government is the only one who should be doing this. This is because the government, the agent with coercive control over an individual, is the only one who should be measuring up their rights and enforcing them. That is not only because of the duty of care they have due to the power of the state, but secondly, because they're the only ones with the expertise to understand legislation and to do the rigorous understanding of what hate speech is likely to be, which circumvents all the damages of why the actors of Substack are bad that Callum talks to you about, right? So we think that they are like, it is completely like not different because they're just a forum on which these views are perspective. Now, I'm going to engage with the nuance that they bring to this claim, which is where they tell you that like you already consent to doing this because you like will ban things like incitement to violence. I think this is very, very different because it doesn't exist on the same level as hate speech. Insofar as we explain to you why hate speech is so nebulous and so different around the world, whereas incitement to violence is a much clearer law that the government is able to enforce. I think this is why we see so many more like where like incitement to violence is something we're able to take Donald Trump to court for, but we can't take him to court for hate speech because it's much more complicated in those places, right? This is an extension of a government as actor, an extension of a clear law that exists, whereas you can't apply it to hate speech laws as they are so nebulous and often non-existent in countries, right? So given you can't extend the government actor, which is the only legitimate actor, you can't do that then on social media platforms. Okay then, let's talk about why we think these people are going to go to other platforms and why it's particularly damaging. We tell you a couple of things about this, right? And these are twofold. I think there's a lack of response to half of this claim. The first thing is that we tell you they're likely to run to other platforms because it's likely to be that they feel that they can get better representation of their own views there. They give you one response to this, which is basically, yeah, Substack is just really particularly great because you can say more on that platform, and that means that you're going to stick around there. I just think they misunderstand the mass movement of people on the right who are willing to move. Notice how things like Truth Social were just an entire new social network created to, which the right emigrated to en masse, and they were willing to abandon the well-established ones. I think people who feel that their rights are being infringed upon are happy to emigrate en masse to entirely new platforms which are created to exactly replicate the model of Substack, but without those regulations. But additionally, I think even if that doesn't happen, even if they remain on Substack, what they do is still search out just an additional platform as an outlet for those views, which they feel. Now, this is all intensified by the second part of Callum's claim, which doesn't receive sufficient response, but I will take a POI before I analyze that, if there is one.
Harvard's president just said that an incitement of violence is subjective and depends on context as well. If it's true that incitement of violence is subjective as well, and Substack already regulates it, then on your side of the house, you're probably guilty of the same amount of ambiguity.
I don't think the delta is as clear here, right? I think that incitement to violence is something more tangible because we can like decide when you are encouraging violence to take place, whereas hate speech is much more nebulous insofar as what constitutes a group that you might hate. But to be honest, if you want to go extreme here, we'll stand with whatever is principally consistent with our side, and we're happy to take that line. But I think given this discrepancy in regulations already exists, and they exist on most platforms, i.e. hate speech regulations on platforms are new, incitement to violence regulations are old, they're much more tried and tested and much more effective in most cases. Callum tells you why victims are why people feel victimized on these platforms, and that's likely to be very pernicious. What he explains to you, right, is that these people are already looking for an excuse to say the government is trying to silence them. What this looks like then, panel, is a pivot away from any narrative which tells you like they should be the good regulators, right? So what is happening here is that they are feeling their free speech being regulated, and their response to this is not, well, that is reasonable, and that is something that I shouldn't fight against, but rather that they are being victimized. That allows them to garner much more sympathy, and in fact more people are likely to react to this. Notice how this intersects with normalization, because when it is like normalized that you are being victimized, you are in fact hurt by the government, it's something that you're willing to respond to in a much more visceral way. For these reasons, the motion has to fall.
Thank the speaker. Third Gov, whenever you're ready.
Hi, I'm sorry about turning off my camera. I just have really bad Wi-Fi, so can everyone like see and hear me fine?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. If I do cut out, someone on my team, please call me or something, because I probably won't notice. I get super concentrated in my speeches. And also, I will take my like POIs verbally, please. Debate is not about changing the world. Not all at once. We can change the world little by little by doing one thing at a time. Op ignores this, and since on their side we find absolutely zero change and absolutely zero improvement, that is already enough to win us the ballot. Before I move on to the points of clash on this debate, I will tell you what the opposition have to prove and prove to you why they did not do that throughout their debate, therefore making their path to the ballot very difficult. First of all, they had to prove that there will be a harm from not banning hate speech larger than the ones that come from hate speech. They did not do this. They also had to prove why people were entitled to hate speech on their side of the house, but they didn't. So the burden on their side was not met. They also bring you a very weak and marginal constructive that does not actually address the problem the debate wants to address. Because their first two arguments were, one, it's that this would be bad at regulating, and two, that people would do hate speech somewhere else. The thing is, this is either A, marginal, or B, symmetrical on both sides of the house, as yes, we do recognize that hate speech exists on both the proposition and the opposition, so it is simply not good enough to win them this debate. So beginning with our first point of clash, which is that on social responsibility, where we tell you that Substack has accepted that they have a social responsibility because they ban harmful content in order to protect both A, their users, and B, the greater community. They protect their users from seeing this harmful material and what that may cause them, because discomfort triggers and trauma, and it'll also cause them to join in this behavior in some instances. They also protect the larger community by preventing the harms that can come from things like pornography, for example, the non-consensual use of this, or minors getting access to this platform, and B, violence in the greater community incited by their platform. Therefore, no thank you, they have to ban hate speech as well, because it is equally, if not more, harmful to the community, as it infringes on people's rights, brings people discomfort, and has a wrong influence on minors, just as pornography does, and just as the info slide said, and it can also lead to violence and violent groups. It also harms the greater community through polarization, and if people want to be equals, they can do it somewhere else where nothing is banned. These platforms, again, exist on both sides of the house. But as you said, the far right travels en masse. But the thing about these platforms is that they have not taken any sort of responsibility because they don't ban anything. So this is symmetrical. Anyways, you only address the violence aspect of the info slide because you tell us oh, hate speech is not the same as violence. Sure, this is true, but it can incite and is verbally violent. Hate speech often leads to violence. People often aren't hateful enough to be verbally abusive to someone and then not do anything about it afterwards. That can often it often leads to worse things, and even if it doesn't, it's still intrinsically harmful. And they also tell you oh, they only ban violence, but you never address again the other things that the info slide was talking about. It harms the community. Pornography harms communities non-violently, similar to hate speech in its lowest extent, so therefore it's still relevant. These arguments still stand, and they're important because they fulfill our burden as to why Substack has to ban this. So our case stands strong in this debate. What do they tell you on this point? No, thank you. They tell you, as an owner of a building, I don't have the responsibility to ensure that hate speech doesn't happen in my building. You don't have this responsibility because you can't stop it from happening. But you do have a responsibility to, for example, put railings on stairs or to make sure that the elevators are safe. If people choose to jump off, that is their problem. But you have a responsibility to protect the people in your building as much as you can. So this analogy actually works perfectly in our favor. Moving on to our second point of clash, which is that on human rights, where we tell you that people do not have a right to hate speech because they are actively harming others. But people do have a right to not being hated because of things like their sexual orientation, their race, or their nationality, because those things are not actively harming other people. Therefore, by banning hate speech in Substack, not only are you not infringing on people's human rights, because for example, people can't just express themselves by killing each other. This is not something that will hold up in court. Your First Amendment rights don't hold up in cases like these. No, thank you. But you are protecting people's rights to live in peace, just to live in peace and to not fear for their lives. Because hate speech also makes people afraid because of what those who use hateful speech are also often capable of doing. And hate speech is not political discourse. We are having a friendly debate and we are not being hateful towards each other. So I don't see how these are the same. There is very little engagement with this argument throughout their bench. They don't address the fact that people don't have a right to infringe on other humans' rights, even if they do have a right to freedom of speech, which is the only thing that they responded to in this case. But the thing is that there's limitations to freedoms in order to protect society. You can't kill someone in the name of freedom of expression. Defamation isn't allowed in freedom of the press, etc. So this is justified. Therefore, these arguments still stand, and it's important because there's a clear win on this principle. No, thank you. You also tell us how there's too much hate speech to address. Okay, Even if it is true, at least we address it. You change and benefit no one. So even if we only change and take away a little bit of hate speech, it is enough to win at the debate, because you never tell us how you change this at all, and we already proved to you why your constructive does not work. You also tell us how useful articles will be removed. This is unlikely to happen en masse, as UP characterizes. And even if it were, we greatly prefer a couple of articles being removed for a little while and then being put back than people using and receiving literal slurs and being hated on. Also, things are already removed in this platform because of inciting violence or because of having like pornography. So this was likely to happen to an extent on your side anyways, and even if it's not as great, we weigh that more heavily. Before I move on, I will take a POI.
Why do you value hate speech over restrictions of freedom of speech without cause, i.e. those who are wrongly banned? Therefore, there is no justification and both impact the identity, which is crucial to
I understand your point. Thank you. The thing is, we understand that the mechanisms that are in place at the moment for like restricting hate speech are not perfect. But the thing is, on our side of the house, they have room to improve. They have room to get better, and less people's rights to freedom of speech will be infringed upon. But the thing is, the right to like freedom of speech and the right to living your life in peace and to not fearing for it, like they're not weighed at the same level. We would much prefer for people to feel safe in a world where they are simply existing. Moving on to our third point of clash, which is that of where hate speech happens. And we will engage with what little their case actually built upon. Because we tell you here that it is Substack's responsibility to move this away from their platform to the best of their ability, as they already do with other things. That there are existing mechanisms that will improve with AI, that hate speech is principally bad and should therefore be like prevented. But they tell you, like in their second and third, like in their first and second speeches, that like it's an academic platform and that like you can restrict an academic platform. But the thing is, if hate speech happens here, then people are more likely to believe it because it is happening, as you said, in an academic platform. So it's just not something that we can allow to happen in Substack specifically. And people will move. You also tell us how people will move to other platforms like social media. But there are existing mechanisms like those on TikTok that ban people from even saying like the word death and murder, and have been very effective in getting people shadow banned to like stop hate speech. And if they do partake in this, they will get banned, such as Trump did for hate speech on Twitter before that became X. So because we protect the people that are being hated against, because we actually protect people's rights, and because we actually fulfill Substack's responsibility as a company, it is a very clear proposition ballot, very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. Call upon the third opposition speaker to end the case off for the side of opposition, the constructive speeches. You're here.
Hello. Can everybody see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay then. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1.
Panel, banning hate speech doesn't ever stop people from engaging in hate. Hate is endemic from schools to social media to workplaces. Banning hate speech on a small platform like Substack cannot solve it hate, but actually makes it worse. This is a very clear debate, and I don't want side proposition to confuse things, right? This is a very, very clear debate. I'd like to contextualize. Our burden is to defend and only defend Substack. We don't need to defend all hate speech sharing on all platforms, and that is an unfair burden to push. I think firstly what I want to do is take a step back and actually talk about what both sides look like. From first, they told us that it looks like 3 things. 1, it's a unique space with subscribers. It is a place where there's aggressive abuse and also where they use AI to moderate. Now, later that on, they tell us they use people to moderate, but we'll tell you why. So a couple of points about this setup. Firstly, they tell us that it's subscribers, meaning that people opt into this, meaning that they sign up to it, meaning that people with existing views sign up to them. So
So obviously this impact is limited. Secondly, they tell us, this is aggressive abuse, but they clearly didn't read the info side because things that incite violence is excluded from this motion. And thirdly, they tell us about regulation. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about this regulation. Why do you think that the moderation of speech is bad on Substack? This is something we push throughout our bench. Firstly, I think it's very difficult to have a good AI algorithm because even large companies have not figured it out. We see that Twitter, Instagram, they still receive lots of complaints and legal complaints about this. Secondly, we told you that algorithms are binary and they cannot pick between layers, right? The intent behind it, the irony, the sarcasm, those who use these modes are often the ones who are criticizing these problems and meaning. For example, in To Kill a Mockingbird, when you use the N-word, you're trying to deliver something greater. Because there's no discretion, they will often default to censoring, so they'll always default to like censoring your speech and limiting your freedom of speech. Thirdly, we told you about the euphemism treadmill, and because we told you it's a large passage, it's really difficult to use AI to actually read through all the complex idea and the nuance behind it. They also told us that like humans can regulate it, right? We tell you that firstly, who designs if it's humans, they probably also have cognitive biases. Who are these moderators? Right? They never expand on this later. Secondly, I think the sheer volume of things mean that they cannot regulate this. This means that no matter what format they use, they're infringing on, so missing some hate speech. So they're a very unreliable system. As a matter of fact, this will be worse because people will be left off guard and blindly believe that everything on the platform is properly regulated. So they will actually internalize these ideas even more and actually internalize these hate speech. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is why the harm is worse, because this is something that we push on our side of the house. I want to do some meta-analysis, because in their absolute best case, they get less hate speech. But no panel, this is on only one platform, that is Substack, and so therefore the delta is marginal. But we can win by saying that more hate speech occurs everywhere, because additionally this intensified the harm in everywhere, because they get more sympathy and jump onto other platforms. What did we tell you about this? I think we tell you that there's a shifting of the narrative and victimization, because the banning of hate speech gives more ammunition to these individuals with hate views, because they already have mistrust of the state. But you can say the establishment is against you, you already mistrust it, and so therefore they can propagate and incite anti-state narrative and get more people on board in the public sphere, which is actually the harmful thing. Secondly, they can leave to other platforms. They want to express and share their views, so they will also speak it out more loudly. The only attack we get from this is that you cannot move from Twitter or other platforms because regulation exists. But we tell you that there are things like 4chan, Donald Trump's social media, Telegram. We tell you these all exist, and you can always propagate and actually have a concentrated amount of people to engage with this. Then I want to engage with the topic about more harm and social responsibility, right? I think they tell you, the thesis that they tell you is that they should regulate hate speech. They have a social responsibility because it is harmful for society.
POI.
To ask a couple of questions. One, where does social responsibility stem from? I think this is still contingent on consequentialist impacts, meaning that they have the responsibility to make the decision that makes the biggest impact, that reduces the greatest harm to society. I think that this is probably not going to be because it's the analysis they give still applies. One, if laws still apply, then there's probably still deterrence in real life. And secondly, if people hold back in real life, they will continue to do so. They never prove why, one, they can reach a wide enough audience fan to normalize this culture, especially when we told you this is an opt-in system for people who already have these beliefs. And two, this does not happen in a vacuum. You consume like other media, and you're not only consuming a Substack in a vacuum. Okay. But what do we tell you, right? We tell you we prevent the greatest moral harm when we protect people the most. Because one, where incitement of violence and pornography is banned, the actual moral harms are removed, right? Because harms are only right insofar as it's harming you as a person. Secondly, those people who engage in the platform opted into this. So this means that victims are actually insulated from this, because what their comparative is that the hate speech occurs on like other platforms and like probably like social media, because they can't regulate it enough. And this means that victims are exposed to it, and this is where harm occurs even more. And B, the people who are exposed to this is probably the same, like people with already entrenched views. So therefore, you're not expanding your audience and expanding expanding the number of hate people like on social media, right? Third, we tell you we protect freedom of speech and therefore we protect people most. Because I think the expression of identity is fundamental to human nature. Now, note they never actually weigh why this is like this principle, right? And we think this is fundamental to human nature, and this is an expression of your identity, therefore is important. But B, I think states can restrict liberties due to the social contract, but Substack is illegitimate because they do not have a social contract. And C, I think political discourse will decrease because of the chilling effect, because people don't want to be banned, they'll just less likely going to speak out for their views, and therefore this impact is greater. Fourthly, about engagement, I think it's probably likely to identify these hateful individuals much more because you can actually keep an eye on them and actually engage with them. For example, if there's a 16-year-old who likes to watch these things or talk about these things, you can identify them, teach them, talk to them. This is what these people want the most, instead of isolating even further. Lastly, I want to talk about morals, because this is the last thing they push, right? I think the first thing is all principles are arbitrary, so we weigh them up using consequences. Like it's hard to pin down where the actual moral harm is. Okay, so I think sexuality, I think integrity and is only like removed if I'm aware of the attack. The intuition pump here is it's possible that everyone is talking about behind my back. It is possible that my coaches are talking about my speech behind my back in that room. But do I care? No, because I don't know what they are. So at best this is an assumption. So this is not an attack on my integrity if I don't know what is happening and if it's not directly affecting me, right? B, they talk about this could have harm and therefore this is a moral bad. But we tell you this is highly unlikely harm that somehow would wander, someone would wander up to the website, click on it, subscribe it, and scroll through it. We just think this harm is very unlikely. And therefore, the most important thing to note in this debate panel is that proposition to impact can only be accessed if all hate speech is solved. That is to say, if they really care about integrity, then any sort of hate speech on any platform is probably bad. But I think that insofar as we prove that, insofar as we prove that this is a more tangible harm that you get from a freedom of speech, and these are and actually these things will intensify on other platforms as well, then we actually prove the greatest impact on the round, and therefore I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker. Call upon the op reply to give speech not exceeding 4 minutes. Sit there.
Audible and visible? Excellent.
Yes.
Right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, proposition are asking you to jump out of the frying pan into the fire. They can't prove to you that they create real delta on hate speech because social media platforms are so notoriously awful at regulating it. Instead, people who now believe there are victims and have that narrative reinforced by those around them jump ship to create their own dangerous echo chambers completely free from political discourse, as we see under the status quo. Okay, couple of things then. Firstly, let's talk about why we don't think they're going to be able to successfully get hate speech and why their regulations are going to have harms on free speech. This is a few reasons. Firstly, we explained to you why AI is likely to be incredibly poor at regulation, why it is unable to understand nuance. This is consistent down our bench and never analysed why AI is able to successfully understand the nuances of human emotion, especially in the long-form text as it appears on things like Substack. But also notice that the nature of hate speech is nebulous, i.e. internationally, this is very difficult to apply universally because the way you code your algorithm is likely to not apply to those laws as they exist universally in those cases. But crucially, even if you think they get reviewed by a human board later on, this means suspending most information. And due to this, I think it is safer for these platforms to just opt to crack down, i.e. to remove anything that might be seen as at risk of being hate speech until they can review it, which in practice means removing most things that could be at risk from the platform, regardless of whether it's legitimate. A couple of reactions to this. Their implementation is massively inconsistent. This means that a lot of hate speech is likely to filter through the gaps, massively mitigating the impacts they get later. But instead, we flip this and explain why they're likely to damage discourse on the platform. We explain to you why, one, they remove good stuff by legitimately infringing on people's like freedom of speech and their capacity they have to express their own views. But secondly, Callum analyzes to you the chilling effect that this then creates, because when you think there is this crackdown, you are just unwilling to express views which you think cross the line. Now notice, they tried to tell you that political discourse wasn't infringed upon because you don't need hate speech to do political discourse. No, you don't, but we do need to discuss around the issues of hate speech, because that is where some of our most critical debates lie in status quo. That chilling effect was our mechanism from first. Now, they never analysed to you why they're okay to infringe upon free speech. They analyse why it's okay to infringe upon free speech when that is hate speech, but not why people who are exercising their entire right to free speech, which is entirely independent of that, have any legitimacy to be infringed upon. I don't think they can weigh this on utility, given that they do so much to explain why the rights of individuals and identity matter so much. I think infringing on these individuals is never something they justified, has to be weighed highly in the round. But we're happy to accept that at absolute worst, these moral harms largely cancel each other out, and that we're willing to move instead to the practical. I want to flag that their moral claims, where they talked about why no one should have a right to hate speech and why things like Substack having a role, were all reasons for governments to ban hate speech, or the governments who are the actors with the duty of care to regulate hate speech more. That falls out with this round and was never specified in this. We gave you reasons as to why Substack doesn't have the expertise or the duty of care to its people in the same extent to protect this. So again, this falls out with. Where we think the real delta lies in this round then is the practical harms. We think this is still able to weigh against, well, Substack should protect people, because if its ultimate aim is protection, then utility is the goal. If you think Substack opts into protecting people, if keeping people on that platform rather than allowing them to go to things like Truth Social, then that's the best metric that they can do, so it all flies contingent to this practical, because all of our harms are upstream, right? If we tell you that the normalization is work on things like 4chan and Truth Social, then the normalization is all exacerbated under their side. We tell you why, one, they get a huge amount more sympathy because now they can confirm the narrative that they're victims. They say, the government doesn't want you to hear this, Substack doesn't want you to hear this, and that confirms to people they are people that should be followed and idolized to an even greater extent, as we've seen with icons of free speech under the status quo. This also looks like reactionary policies like those from Musk, which make Twitter much more liberal, but in response to these regulations. So they get lots more support. But when they don't, even when they don't get lots more support, they just flee to other platforms to express these views. Now, these are ones where their radicalization can go to an even greater extent, and they're never going to be infringed upon. What we think this likely means is, rather than these people just stopping doing hate speech because they're like, oh, regulations, they feel infringed upon, and so they express it elsewhere. In these places with less regulation and with this newfound anger, they're likely to enact the greatest harm. If they care about protecting vulnerable people, then they are out of the frying pan into the fire. We're so proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker. Go for reply whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm audible. Thank you. Let me simplify your bold panel and assume that everything that team opposition is true and tell you why we still win this debate. Note our first argument is enough to win the round, and it has not been taken down by any other claims, even if we take it at their best. Our argument was that Substack has a responsibility to prevent hate speech it can identify because it is already controlling content and making an active decision not to prevent it. So this means that they're taking responsibility on the harms to individuals. Their response is hate speech is nebulous. But let's take them at their best. Sure, some hate speech might be nebulous and very hard to identify, but other hate speech won't be nebulous, and they already admit that. Words such as the F word, the N word, and other explicit content are not nebulous at all. Substack is looking at this content, and they have a responsibility to ban their spread of hate speech in those instances. So sure, they have some hate speech might be nebulous, but others will not, and they have a responsibility to ban the one that they can see and they can identify, because that is the one that they are contributing to, are allowing it to pass and to harm people. They have a responsibility to prevent to continue improving their mechanisms so that they can later on identify the nebulous one. But as of right now, they continue to have a responsibility to actually ban hate speech and intervene. This means that the motion should pass, even if team opposition's right that a lot of hate speech is nebulous. The next thing that they argue is that people are going to move to other platforms. We would argue that those other platforms probably also have a responsibility to ban hate speech on their own. But the truth is that this debate is simply about whether Substack has that responsibility or not. We're proving to you that Substack does have a responsibility, and therefore, even though it like moving to other platforms might end up like causing harm as well, the truth is that Substack is already fulfilling its responsibility, and in a world where we can only control our own actions, that's the best thing that we can do, and that is enough to prove that Substack should actually regulate and ban this policy. The third thing that they say is that like they don't know if this might not even have an impact on minorities, on these vulnerable groups. The truth is that Substack cannot properly identify whether or not it will actually impact those minorities or those vulnerable groups. But in the moment in which it has the possibility of harming somebody else, it needs to do something to prevent it. So again, even if this claim is true, the motion should pass, because the truth is that the Substack has a responsibility to prevent something that might be harmful and might be seen by minorities. But note that this was not the only mechanism that we brought to you towards harming these vulnerable groups. It's also about oftentimes indirect actions when simply people internalizing that hate speech and then using it elsewhere. The second thing that I think it's important to point out is that let's bring back our reasoning on why it's unlikely that this will affect political discourse, because this is something that Up Third tried to emphasize. The truth is that we gave you a lot of intuition prompts that for instance, we have engaged in the debate and still there's not been any attacks towards our own identities. The truth is that individuals are able to communicate their political ideas and debate about them without having to use hate speech. So it is unlikely to actually harm political discourse in any way. Secondly, we told you that there's some very clear hate speech, and that is probably the one that we'll be banning on our side of the house, because that's like what Substack needs to do in order to fulfill its responsibility. Thirdly, we also tell you that there's commissions and guidelines that are public and are constantly improving, because there's a lot of people commenting on them and what they need in order to improve. Fourthly, we told you that on their side of the house, they're guilty of the same thing as best, because the truth is that Substack is already regulating on certain things. So that very likely means that Substack also has a lot of things that it's infringing on. This means that on their side of the house, like this is not a big point on for them, because it means that on their side of the house, they're guilty of the same thing. So that probably shouldn't be a voting point for their side. And lastly, let's bring back that we also tell you that there's very serious harms to individuals, such as people who are feeling bad about themselves, people who are feeling threatened and attacked about their identities. And there's also indirect harms such as political discourse and affecting modern society in general. Those are very tangible harms that opposition just seems to deny. For those reasons, I think this is a very clear ballot for Team Mexico. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for the round, everyone.